it's been an ongoing joke around my family for years. No matter where we go on the trip, I'm gonna find somebody I know. We can go anywhere. Well, a couple of years ago, we were in Fort Walton Beach, and Cody turned around and he's looking for me, and he looks out the window of the store, and I'm standing out there on the sidewalk talking to a guy. Cody come out and he said, How can you possibly find somebody that you know in Fort Walton Beach? I said, well, I didn't know him. He said, oh, you just started talking. I said, well, yeah, but I said, I did find out. I said, he's from around the Jackson area, and he goes to church with a friend of mine. So anywhere we go, you know, on a journey, you're going to run into people. We were in the Ozarks here a few years ago and found out, went in a little antique shop and got to talking to a lady, and she said, where y'all from? I said, Mississippi. She said, oh. She said, well, do you know where Flowood, Mississippi is? I said, Van Sanders, yes, ma'am. She said, well, my grandbaby was born at Women's Hospital in Flowood, Mississippi. I said, well, my wife works at Women's Hospital in Flowood, Mississippi. And I'm sure it's got nothing to do with the fact that I like to talk. But I always find, you know, anytime we go on a journey, you know, there's going to be people on that journey. You know, we're going to interact with others. And, you know, sometimes that's a good thing, and then sometimes not so good a thing. And you never know who is going to be there for benefit and who that you may run into on a journey that's not so beneficial. And you never know who you're going to see. I think back to a pastor friend that was talking about he and his wife had gone on a Caribbean cruise for their anniversary. And they had gotten on an island out in the Caribbean, and he said, you know, he said, we're all way down here in the Caribbean. He said, we could order us a big bottle of champagne, and nobody at the church is going to ever be any wiser. And he said he didn't get the word out of his mouth good, and a hand come down on his shoulder and said, well, brother, what are you doing here? You never know. Well, this morning we're continuing our sermon series, Journey to the Cross, and this morning's message is entitled, Finding Friends in Strange Places. And on Jesus' journey, he had encounters those last few days, and especially that last 24-hour period. He had some kind of strange encounters with different ones. And this morning it's going to be a little bit different. I'm not going to have you stand as we read because we're going to be going kind of verse by verse. And I'm hoping we're going to be able to get through all of this in time. Y'all did have a big breakfast, didn't you? But we're going to be in Matthew chapter 26. Yep, it's Matthew. This morning in Sunday school we were in Mark and I kept sending them to Matthew. Matthew chapter 26, we're going to begin with verse 57. And we're going to kind of go verse by verse, and we're going to look at different people that were involved in Jesus' journey those last few hours that he was on earth. Starting with verse 57 through 59, it says, And those who had laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance to the high priest's courtyard, and he went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now the chief priest, the elders, and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death. First person we see here is Caiaphas. Now, we'll back up in Matthew's narrative. He doesn't talk about the fact that before he was brought to Caiaphas, Jesus was taken to Annas, Caiaphas' father-in-law. Now, Caiaphas' father-in-law, Annas, was also high priest, but the Romans had removed him as high priest and had placed Caiaphas in that position. Now, the people still view Annas as probably the true high priest, so both of them were seen at. So first Jesus went to Annas, but then he was brought to Caiaphas. Now Caiaphas was the high priest. He was the presiding officer over the Sanhedrin, and was the top religious official over the Jewish faith. Now, this is the man that the people looked to for spiritual guidance. And he had made it his duty to have Jesus killed. And as we talked about the other week, a lot of it had to do with the fact that Jesus had really upset their apple cart. He had come in and he had cleansed the temple twice, telling them that they were thieves and robbers for what they were doing, the way they were selling inside the temple. And it had gone from being a thing where when they first started selling the doves and the animals in the temple, it was for convenience sake. Now it had become a money-making racket, and the priests were making a lot off of this. And Jesus had challenged them on this. So again, their authority had been challenged, and now Caiaphas had made it his duty to try to make sure that Jesus was removed. We also find in these verses the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin were basically the Jewish Supreme Court, and they were made up of the priests and elders of the two main religious classes, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, the Pharisees and the Sadducees had completely different doctrines. They didn't like each other too much. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection, the Sadducees didn't. But you've heard those saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, that's basically what was taking place here. They didn't like one another, but together they didn't like Jesus, so they joined forces for a brief time to try to destroy him. Now, it's sad when we see that happen inside religious circles, but I've seen it happen in churches before. I know a church I was a part of one time, there were, the pastor had been trying to figure out for a while. He said, I think we've got two factions in this church. And he said, there's constantly a fighting. I said, no. I said, I've been studying this, and I think you're going to find out there's a third faction in there. I said, you got two factions that don't like each other, but those two don't like the third faction more than they don't like each other. And sure enough, we ended up finding out that was the case. These two factions got together and tore the church up and got this other group out, and then they went back to fighting among themselves. Makes no sense. But that's basically what was happening here. Both groups had got together and they decided, we've got to get rid of him. We've got to remove him as an obstacle. So here Jesus is, again, they've already basically, in their minds, convicted him. No trial has taken place before they arrested him, but they had already made their minds up. So again, in verse 57 it says, and those who laid hold of him led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, and the scribes and the elders who were assembled. This is the Sanhedrin. And Peter followed close behind them. Verse 59 says, now the chief priests and the elders of all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death. Move down to verse 60. It says, but found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. But at last 2 false witnesses came forward and said, this fellow said that I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. And the high priest arose and said to him, do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you? But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, it is as you say. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, he has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look now, you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think? They answered and said, he is deserving of death. Then they spat in his face, beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you? Then we have the third group here. We have the false witnesses. Now, it always seemed funny to me that the priest was so disturbed that Jesus could commit blasphemy that he tore his clothing and was just so appalled, but it didn't seem to bother him to bring in false witnesses and falsely accuse someone. You ever heard the term self-righteous? You ever heard the term hypocrite? That's basically what the chief priest and the elders, all of these were. So they brought in these false witnesses. Now understand, these are individuals that were more than likely paid for their testimony. It wasn't something that they had seen and did on their own. They were coerced to come in. Again, everything was being set up to try to bring accusation. They had been trying for 3 years to find some kind of reason to bring Jesus in, to have him crucified, but could find nothing. So then they began to manufacture things, and even to the point that they're willing to pay Judas. We already know that they're willing to pay somebody to bring him in, pay somebody to set him up. There's no doubt that they were paying witnesses to bring false testimony. So again, these false witnesses, these are individuals who were more than likely paid for their testimony. But still, they were not really able to find anything. And then they had 2 that brought in a statement of what Jesus had said, trying to bring some kind of accusation. The high priest and the other religious leaders began then to spit on, strike, and to torment Jesus. Not exactly the actions that you'd expect from a religious community, now is it? Yet in the name of God, these men stood up and did this. And it had absolutely nothing to do with God. It was all personal agenda. God was nowhere in any of this. So we have Caiaphas. We have the Sanhedrin that has come into Jesus' journey. We have the false witnesses. And then in verse 69, it says, Now Peter sat outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him, saying, You also were with Jesus of Galilee. But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you're saying. And when he had gone out to the gateway, another girl saw him and said to those who were there, This fellow also was with Jesus of Nazareth. But again he denied with an oath, I do not know the man. And a little later those who stood by came up and said to Peter, Surely you also are one of them, for your speech betrays you. Then he began to curse and swear, saying, I do not know the man. Immediately a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the word of Jesus, who had said to him, Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Remember Peter? Peter's the one that was ready to jump out of the boat and walk on water. Peter's the one that Jesus put his hand upon and said, Peter, you are the rock. Upon this rock I will build my church. Peter's the one that said, Lord, if everyone else leaves you, not me, I will never leave. Peter is the one in the garden who drew his sword and chopped off the ear of the soldier. Now Peter is standing in the garden. Standing out by the fire with the others. And Peter has denied Jesus 3 times. Peter, who was in Jesus' inner circle. Peter, James, and John, those 3 closest comrades of Jesus's. And now, he's denying him just as Jesus had said. Even to the point that he swore an oath. I swear by oath, I don't know this man. And then reached the point of even beginning to curse, to throw out profanities when he was connected back to Jesus. I don't know him. Then he heard the rooster. And Scripture says, he wept bitterly when he realized what he had done. Peter had been with Jesus on this journey for 3 years. And now coming to the end of this journey, he denies him 3 times. You know, I've always heard it said, talking about running a race or a marathon, it doesn't matter how you start, it's how you finish. Peter must have really been hurting because at this point, he wasn't finishing well. His heart was broken. And again, Scripture says, he walked away weeping bitterly for what he had done. Then in chapter 27, verse 1, says, when morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. Then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful, and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And they said, what is that to us? You see to it. Then he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed, and went and hanged himself. But the chief priest took the silver pieces and said, it is not lawful to put them into the treasury, because they are the price of blood. And they consulted together and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. Therefore that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the value of him who was priced, whom they, the children of Israel, priced, and gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. We have Judas. Judas, a man who had been with Jesus 3 years. Judas, a man who had seen the many miracles. Judas, who knew that Jesus was innocent, sold him out for 30 pieces of silver. The thing you may not know about the 30 pieces of silver, that is the price you paid for a dead slave. If you beat somebody's slave and killed them, that was the price you had to pay for it. So basically, he sold Jesus out as a dead slave for the price of a dead slave. Overcome with guilt, he tried to make it right. He goes back to his religious leaders, seeking some kind of redemption, some kind of solace. And these so-called men of God look at him and say, what is this to us? You go fix it. Go handle it yourself. Completely turn their back on him. Feeling like there was no hope and nowhere to turn, Judas hanged himself. Then you have the chief priest. Now understand, the chief priests were in charge of temple worship. They were in charge of the worship at the temple. And these are the same men who sold their conscience and everything to enable them to be able to crucify Christ. They bribed one of his followers. Blood money. Paid out blood money, but then were too self-righteous to take the blood money back. When he brought it back in, it was like it offended them. We can't take this. Why would you bring this to us? This is blood money. It was blood money paid by them. But in their self-righteousness, would not take it back. Instead, used the money to buy a cemetery for foreigners. So on Jesus' journey to the cross, so far we've seen Caiaphas, the high priest, and Annas, the Sanhedrin, the false witnesses. We've seen Peter, who had been on this journey all along, and Judas, one betraying, the other one denying. Then we have the chief priests, who were the very ones who bought Judas, who convinced Judas for the price of a dead slave to sell out Jesus. And then in verse 11, we have Pontius Pilate. Chapter 27, verse 11. It says, now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus said to him, it is as you say. And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then Pilate said to him, do you not hear how many things they testify against you? But he answered him not one word, so that the governor marveled greatly. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. And at that time they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew that they had handed him over because of envy. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, "Have nothing to do with this just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him." You have Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor of Judea. Now Pilate's rule was very turbulent. He had a very turbulent history with Caesar. And most historians believe that he was not exactly in Caesar's good graces, which is probably why he had been put in such a bad region like Judea. In John 19:12, we read that the Jewish leaders used this friction between he and Caesar to try to force Pilate to execute Jesus. They said in John chapter 19, verse 12, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Because anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." Now, do you think these Jewish priests cared one bit about Caesar? Their hope was that the Messiah was going to come and going to completely crush Caesar and the Roman rule. That's what they believed. They believed that when the Messiah appeared, he was going to completely crush all of their adversaries. They would no longer be under any kind of Gentile rule. So they did not care about the Romans. They hated the Romans. They thought all Gentiles were dogs. So they could care less about Caesar. Yet they used this. The priest told Pilate, "This man, he forbids us to give taxes to Caesar. This man forbids us to recognize Caesar. He says that he is our king." But listen, these Jews who hate Caesar said, "But we recognize no king but Caesar." And if you're a friend of Caesar, you're going to execute this man. Because if you release him, you're no friend of Caesar's. They knew that they could cause Pilate difficulties if they just pushed the right buttons. But Pilate continued to marvel at the manner that Jesus responded. Jesus never responded with bitterness. He never responded with hate, would not make any accusations, would not respond to the questions. And most importantly, this Roman, this Gentile who did not believe in the God of gods, found no guilt in Jesus whatsoever. He knew, he realized that the priest had manifested all of these false charges and accusations because there was an envy of Jesus. Pilate even tried to seek out venues by which he could prevent charging Jesus of any crime. First he sent him to Herod. When he realized that Jesus was Galilean, he said, "Herod is in the region. He is in Jerusalem for the Passover. Send him to Herod." He went to Herod. Herod humiliated him. Herod made fun of him. But Herod found no guilt. Again, an evil king here. He found no guilt whatsoever in Jesus, and he sent him back to Pilate. So Pilate sought to try to find a way to keep from bringing any kind of harm to Jesus. First by sending him to Herod. Then he tried to swap him for Barabbas. Barabbas was a murderer. He was a thief. And he felt for sure that the people would choose Jesus, this innocent man, over a known murderer and thief. But it was to no avail. Then we have Pilate's wife in verse 19. It says, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, "Have nothing to do with this just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him." Now, we do not know if Pilate's wife had ever met Jesus, if there was ever any kind of connection whatsoever, but God had shown her something. She knew that he was just. Have you noticed a series of things that are happening here? All of Jesus' own people, all of the religious are finding guilt. They're finding reason to crucify him. And now you've got Herod, as evil as it gets, finding no guilt in him. You've got Pilate, a Roman governor who was not exactly the most just man in the world, finding no guilt. And then you've got Caesar Augustus's daughter finding no guilt in Jesus. You've got all of these people that are not religious, that are following false gods, that are finding that there's no guilt in this man. Matter of fact, she even talks about this just man. She doesn't say that he's just not. This man is just. He's upright. He's righteous. You need to have nothing to do with this. So again, we don't know for sure what the connection, if there had ever been any connection, if she had heard about Jesus. But she risked her own self by getting involved. The wife did not get involved in matters of government, especially in this area. Matter of fact, wives were not even allowed to accompany their governor husbands into regions like this. But because of her family lineage, she was able to go. And she must have been a good woman, because this is not an area that most would choose to go to. Because she left all of the height and popularity of Rome to go live in Judea. And she goes to her husband and says, have nothing to do with this good man. Pilate tried. But then we pick up in verse 20 of chapter 27. It says, but the chief priest and the elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said to them, which of the two do you want me to release to you? They said, Barabbas. Pilate said to them, what then shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ? They all said to him, let him be crucified. Then the governor said, why? What evil has he done? But they cried out all the more, answering, let him be crucified. Next, we have the people. Think about this. These are the same people that a few short days earlier were waving palm branches and singing, Hosanna, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And now they're crying, crucify, crucify. We see how fickle people can be. One day they're praising God, the next day they're saying, crucify. They turn so quick. They followed the wrong leaders. Is there any reason or any wonder why Jesus wept when he looked over Jerusalem and he said, you're missing. You're missing it. You've been praying. You've been seeking it. This is the Passover. This is a celebration that's been pointing you toward the Messiah, and I'm here, and you're missing it. Yet now, they're crying out, crucify, crucify. In verse 24, it says, when Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. And all the people answered and said, his blood be on us and our children. Then he released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. We have Pilate again. He again declares Jesus innocent. He then washes his hands in a symbolic move to show that his hands are clean of Jesus' blood. The people have been whipped into such a bitter frenzy that they're saying something that they do not realize what they're doing. They take an oath saying, let his blood not only be on our heads, but let his blood be on our children's heads as well. so much anger, so much bitterness. You see how it feeds? See, the people were praising God. They were worshiping Jesus when He came in. They marveled at the things that He was doing, saw that He had to be sent from God. And because of embittered priests, because of embittered men, in the name of God, they had turned the people away from God, turned the people away from Christ, and now they were saying, crucify Him and let His blood be on our heads. How quick bitterness and prejudice and anger can spread and defile the people. Then we have Barabbas. In Luke 23:19, we read that Barabbas had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder. This man was a murderer. This man had caused uprisings. You see, they brought Jesus to trial because of blasphemy. The Jewish priest said he claims to be equal with God. He claims to be the Messiah. He claims to be the Son of God. And he's blasphemed. They brought him to Pilate. Pilate could care less about that. You see, Pilate doesn't believe in God anyway. So he was not about to crucify someone for blasphemy against Jewish law. So they had to drum up something else. And then that's when they drummed up these charges of sedition, saying he's trying to lead the people away from Caesar. He's trying to lead a rebellion against the Roman Empire. But yet you've got Barabbas here who had done just that. He had caused a rebellion against the Romans and had even committed murder. And yet the people chose him. He was freed, and Jesus took his place, basically taking on his guilt at that time. Look at verses 27 through 31. It says, Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus to the praetorium and gathered the whole garrison around him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. When they had twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. Then they spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they took the robe off him, put his own clothes on him, and led him away to be crucified. The next group we have on this journey are these Roman soldiers. They stripped Jesus, which was a sign of humiliation. They stripped him nude. Then they put a scarlet robe as a term of mockery, along with a crown of thorns which they shoved deep into his brow. They mocked him. They spat on him. They struck him in the head. See, this was all about total humiliation.